Start taking.
Drive 15 kilometers along any motorway and you're likely to see this bird hovering over the grass verges. It's a kestrel, the most familiar British bird of prey, known traditionally as the Windhover. The kestrel is a specialist hunter who can hover motionless in mid-air on its gently fanning wings. Its head stays firmly fixed in one position as its eyes constantly search for prey in the grass below. The attraction of the motorways for the kestrel is that their banks represent the largest undisturbed grassland reserve in Britain. Undisturbed may seem a strange word to use about a motorway, but these banks are one of the few remaining places in this country free from people, dogs, and agricultural chemicals. And for the hungry kestrel, this no man's land is a rich hunting ground, full of the small mammals and insects on which it depends. This is an adult female kestrel. Kestrels are falcons, long-winged and built for speed, in contrast to hawks, which are broad-winged and more adapted to jinking flight among trees and bushes. That large eye can resolve details 8 times as far away as that of a human. Her hooked talons are needle-sharp for seizing and killing prey. Her beak is hooked too, so that it can pluck and tear the small bird or rodent grasped in its sharp talons. And when on the wing, the kestrel is in a class of its own. As it flies over open country, it combines fast, shallow wing beats with steady glides and even effortless floating. This hardly looks an ideal nesting site for a falcon, but kestrels are remarkably adaptable birds. This pair has chosen a tower block in the heart of London as their eyrie. Their nest is a window box 16 stories above the street. To feed their young, they hunt for sparrows and young pigeons in the streets and parks of the sprawling city below. A recent census showed that approximately 60% of the kestrel pairs living in London are successfully breeding. This pair have returned to raise their young in this improbable nest site several years running. It looks unsuitable to us, but to a kestrel it closely resembles the sort of cliff-top ledge it might choose in a far wilder setting. The slightly smaller male is on the left. It's fairly unusual for males to share in the feeding process at the nest, but with 4 hungry chicks, the female needs his help at this early stage. This is the kestrel's more typical habitat. In grazing farmland, you can expect to find 32 kestrel pairs to every 100 square kilometers. But in intensively farmed arable areas, this can drop to only 12 pairs living in the same large area. Kestrels are extremely adaptable in their choice of nest site. They will lay anywhere, a fork in a tree, a church tower, or even in a hole in the ground. A hay barn is an ideal place, providing they're not disturbed during the breeding season. Eggs are laid at intervals of 1 to 2 days, and if her first clutch is infertile or lost to predators, then the female will lay a second. With kestrels, it's the larger female which does the majority of the sitting. On a neighboring farm, a second pair display to each other in a dead elm. Their distinctive call is important in kestrel communication. This pair's nest site is in a hollow oak. The eggs are beautifully marked, and in the past collectors would pay high prices for a whole clutch. Now egg collecting is illegal, but it's still a problem, particularly for birds of prey. With 3 eggs, this female has got a smaller than average clutch, but then, provided food is plentiful, she'll have a good chance of rearing all 3 chicks. Food is the vital factor, and the short-tailed vole the main prey. When there's a boom in voles, there's also a boom in kestrels. At 1 year old, the female is in peak breeding condition. Her chestnut brown plumage is immaculate, with the heavy barring distinctive of females. Like all falcons, she has a keen eye and a sharp beak essential to her success as a hunter. With luck, this will be the first of many clutches she lays. Kestrels may live up to 16 years. A kilometer away in the hay barn nest, all 3 chicks have hatched. In a bad year, as many as 60% of clutches are deserted by the female before hatching. The young, like all birds of prey, are initially sparsely covered by off-white down. They're almost exclusively cared for and fed by the female for the first few days. If successfully reared, they will remain in the nest for about 4 weeks before fledging. Thunderstorms are not normally a danger to young kestrels, though mortality can occur in exposed nests. Not all nests are as sheltered as this one. Often kestrels use the old open nests of birds like crows. During incubation, the male spends most of his time outside the nest. He can be distinguished by his blue-gray head and fine streaked breast. The female will seldom leave her eggs and depends on her mate to provide all the food she requires. When the eggs hatch, he will have to catch prey non-stop to supply not only his mate, but the whole family. For a bird of prey, keeping flight feathers in perfect condition is essential. Regular bathing is an important part of that process. So the moment the storm is over, the female takes time off from brooding to wash herself. Since her wet feathers could dangerously cool her eggs, she flies to a nearby post to dry off in the warm sun before returning to her nest. At the barn nest, all so far is going well. The female brings in a mouse which her mate has caught and handed over to her outside. At first, she'll tear the prey apart for her family. They weighed about 14 grams on hatching. At 3 weeks, they'll weigh about 250 grams. This growth demands a lot of food. A young kestrel eats around 35% of its body weight daily. The female has to keep up her own strength too, and this means that to feed himself and his family, the male needs to bring in from 6 to 8 small mammals daily. In a good summer and a good vole year, this is fairly easy. When voles are scarce, you'll have to make it up with small birds, and that's far harder. The hen waits at the entrance, perhaps watching for her mate with his next contribution. In the hollow oak, the second female laid her 3 eggs and started incubating a fortnight later. The chicks have just emerged, blind, scrawny, and resembling their ancient reptilian ancestors. It's difficult to imagine that within a year they will have matured into sleek and agile hunters which can hover motionless on the wind. As the chicks at the hay barn nest get older, the female is starting to spend more time away from the nest. Unlike most birds of prey, kestrel chicks show no signs of sibling rivalry. In fact, the bonds they develop at this early stage will persist, and juveniles will even fly around together after fledging. This post stands near the oak tree nest and is the place where the female kestrel receives freshly caught food from her mate. The young are now just over a week old. Their mother tears up a vole for them. Kestrels are opportunists. Their diet consists primarily of small mammals, but they will also eat birds, bats, lizards, insects, and even worms. We know this because kestrels discard bones and other indigestible bits of food in a pellet, rather like an owl. Kestrels are successful hunters because of their ability to hover. But this burns up a lot of energy and requires a good headwind to make it economical. However, hovering does allow the bird to scan the ground for small prey like this mouse hiding in the grass. Movement can be fatal and produces an instant dive or stoop. Often the prey is carried to the feeding post to be plucked. The talons are the weapons that do the killing, usually instantaneously. Inside the hollow tree, the fast-growing young are waiting for their mother to pluck and prepare a pied wagtail. Their hooked beaks are already well developed. The chicks will soon be able to do the job for themselves. When the male does bring food to the nest, he's so quick about it you can hardly spot him. He flies off, seeing the family is well supplied, probably to eat the catch himself. The female will continue to cram meat into the beaks of her voracious young until she senses that they've had enough. When her young have finished, she flies off with the remains of the wagtail to eat it in peace. The male perches nearby, feeding on a chaffinch. Inside the nest, the female prepares another small bird. At 2 weeks old, the young are fast beginning to color up, their first feathers showing through the down. They will rely on their mother to feed them until they're 20 days old. It's now becoming apparent that these strange-looking infants will shortly develop into handsome falcons. Their barred juvenile plumage is already evident. Kestrels are successful birds of prey which range throughout Europe and Asia, from the Arctic to the Sahara Desert. They're widespread throughout much of Britain and are commonly found nesting on our coasts. The steep ledges and overhangs of sea cliffs provide ideal nesting sites for the kestrel, while the short grass headlands provide rich feeding grounds. A female kestrel has raised her brood on a cliff face with a sheer drop of 30 meters down to the sea. She delivers a meal to her 2 growing chicks before setting off again to glide on the air currents in search of prey. As she soars, her long wings look surprisingly rounded and her tail fanned. Though the kestrel is one of the most common raptors in Britain, it's often confused with other small falcons, such as the sparrowhawk. But there are snags to the clifftop site. Herring gulls are one of them. They're always ready to steal other birds' prey, even a falcon's. In sight of the herring gulls are juvenile kestrels taking their first practice flights away from the nest. Kestrels depend upon their sophisticated flying ability not only to hunt, but also to leave home. Juvenile birds tend to move further than adults, and many birds raised on the south coast find their way across the channel. More commonly, juveniles make short, random journeys in their search for suitable hunting grounds. It's midsummer, and the oak tree female is still bringing up her brood. The hen sits sunning herself outside her nest in the oak. Her chicks are now able to feed themselves, so she can enjoy a bit of a break. But even now, she regularly returns to her 3-week-old offspring. The male is still working hard to feed his family. This year has been an unusually good one for the kestrels. All the chicks have survived. When prey is in short supply, less than half the chicks which hatch will fledge. There's even evidence that, due to a reduction in small mammal populations, kestrels are on average laying fewer eggs. Kestrel numbers have in fact declined by 30% in Britain during the past 25 years. Kestrels were very successful during the 1970s, but since then, the practice of intensive farming with the widespread use of herbicides and pesticides has reduced the numbers of small mammals so vital to this falcon survival. For the kestrel, this is no time of plenty. At around the 25th day, the young are nearly ready to leave the oak tree nest. The young males, smaller and more active, usually leave home first, often as much as 2 or 3 days before the females. They're now quite able to tear the food themselves, but they won't be strong enough on the wing or sufficiently confident to hunt just yet. The juveniles initially remain close to the nest during the day, but return to it to roost. They survey the world outside from the relative safety of the oak tree branches. The family group stays together for 2 or 3 weeks after the chicks have fledged. During this time, the juveniles continue to get food from their parents. Then, in late July or August, the family separates permanently. The young adults perfect their flying techniques and learn to catch insects, which will sustain them until they can manage larger prey. Next year, the survivors, probably no more than 40%, come back to breed in much the same areas as they were reared. The kestrel is one of Britain's most familiar falcons, which we are used to seeing flying over our fields, cliffs, and even our cities. And yet, because our use of the countryside reduces small mammals, the kestrel is being starved out. This elegant bird of prey, so much a part of our countryside, is in decline. It's thought that there are now only 50,000 nesting pairs in the United Kingdom, and the kestrel on the amber conservation list. Ironically, our noisy motorways are relatively undisturbed by man and act as a vital refuge for the kestrel.
Wild Britain returns at the same time next Sunday. Next tonight here on 4, how the media scaremongering of the 1980s threw up more questions than answers in the search for a cure for cancer.